emerging economies led by the outperformers have certainly been very strong engines of global growth in the past, accounting for maybe 2/3 of overall global growth. We think that in future, they certainly have the potential to continue being really important engines of growth. It depends on their ability, or the ability of the economies that haven't grown so rapidly, to raise their productivity levels to something like 4 to 4.5% per year. If that were to happen, the emerging economies could contribute something like $11 trillion of incremental GDP by 2030, which is like adding a whole new economy of the size of China to the global GDP.
If you look at where the consumers are going to be, they'll be predominantly in emerging economies, actually predominantly in Africa. If you look at where the resources are today, the resources tend to also be in emerging economies. We look at political and macroeconomic stability, which is important for growth. A lot of these economies are experiencing a lot more stability. So I fundamentally believe that the future growth of the world will come from these emerging economies. And some of the fastest growing economies, 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies today, are in Africa, right? And that will continue.
Services are going to be a much more important part of the path forward for emerging economies than they were in the past. And that's going to mean that emerging economies are going to need to be more flexible, have stronger enabling environments, because the path will be a little bit less linear than it was for the first set of countries that industrialized. So this is going to really require a different playbook, as it were, a different set of growth strategies.
One thing to remember is that the Chinese economy is something like 8 times probably in terms of size what it was in 1990. So what was 10% growth in terms of volume growth now is equivalent to something like 1 or 2% growth in volume terms. So even if China slows down from the last 30 years of 10% growth to something like 5 or even 4% growth, in terms of the volume growth and the extra demand that it places on the rest of the world, it will be that much more important and effective in pulling up the whole world. India and China alone in the next 15 years will provide incremental demand equivalent to the demand from all of Western Europe and the United States in the 1980s and 1990s. So in that sense, the context is different, but probably more positive rather than negative.